Growing up with an NES meant that I got to play a lot of really good games, and unsurprisingly, some of my favorites were the Mario games. Of the three on the NES, my favorite is Super Mario Bros. 2, with Super Mario Bros. 3 following closely behind. I played Super Mario Bros. 2 constantly as a kid, fiddling around with Game Genie exploits and experimenting with the different playable characters. This game actually birthed what would become a hot, swollen hatred for Toad, who's by far my very least favorite character in all Mario media. Last year, while I was out hunting for games, I found Super Mario Advance, a Game Boy Advance remake of Super Mario Bros. 2. I was a bit torn about buying it because I already owned Super Mario All-Stars and didn't know what I would do with yet another remake. I eventually bit the bullet and brought it home, and after popping it in to test it out, I discovered that Super Mario Advance was a very different adventure than my humble childhood gaming experience. After doing a bit of reading and watching some reviews on the game, I learned that the remake was widely praised for its innovations over the simpler NES version. Well, I finally played the GBA version through for the first time lately, and I can honestly say that I'd take the NES version over the GBA version any day. I think it's pretty fair to say that after playing the same game over and over for many years, it becomes familiar, but might get to feel a bit too repetitive for some. While some people might move on to new challenges, others that really love the game might find themselves craving a little more: new levels, new mechanics, or new adventures. The expectations for a slightly different version of a world that you've grown up in can be really exciting, and an overhaul like Super Mario Advance had the potential to bring that to the table. When I first turned on the game, I wasn't disappointed in the slightest. The intro cinematic was a lot of fun, and I thought it was creative to present a gameplay preview rather than retelling of backstory. When I entered the first level, I think I had a grin on my face. I was not falling from the sky for the first time in over 2 decades, and instead got to hop down a cascade of clouds to find giant Shy Guys and carrot-loaded springy hills below. It was a nice surprise, and I was a bit taken with the experience. It made me feel hopeful that a game that I really loved might be able to give me something new again. There are lots of things that I really liked about Super Mario Advance. At first glance, the game is beautiful. It's colorful and vibrant, and I'd say that the graphics are comparable to the All-Stars version, which was a definite upgrade from the NES game. That old familiar music was back too, but with some fancy modifications that had me bopping around. I did also really enjoy the new music that plays whenever a vase is entered. That whole audio-visual aesthetic in that particular area reminded me very much of Yoshi's Island. One of the first big changes that I really enjoyed was the incorporation of ace coins. I take the same path through levels every time I play Super Mario Bros. 2, and for the first time ever I felt encouraged to explore other routes, especially in later levels where the path branches a lot. I normally dislike the pressure of a collectathon, but here I found it took the same old levels I've been playing forever and made them feel refreshed. Apart from the obvious push toward having players replay levels, the ace coins also exposed some old game secrets, like the warp area in 3-1 where you fall down the waterfall. Eventually, someone's going to try jumping down that hole when they can't find that 5th coin. After completing the game, a challenge featuring Yoshi opens up where you search for eggs that appear in place of classic mushrooms in the subspace. This was also a great addition to keep people playing long after they finished their first playthrough. Despite all of the aforementioned excellent points about Super Mario Advance, one of the things that immediately irritated me was the addition of voices to the game. I wasn't expecting it at all, and it was really distracting. I don't personally feel like it added anything to the game overall, especially because I couldn't understand any of the garbled squeaks that came out of the princess or Toad, and could barely make out some of the stuff that Mario and Luigi said. Even worse was hearing the 4 characters grunting and yelling every time they pulled a vegetable out of the ground. It got old really quickly and became especially obnoxious in the second world while digging in the sandy areas. The boss taunts were particularly loathsome, especially Birdo's.
This is as far as you know!
I didn't find the lines to be particularly well acted, and hearing Birdo recoil in pain after being hit with an egg also felt wrong somehow. I know it's a game meant for a younger audience, but every time I had to hear,
I'm gonna finish you off.
it made me want to shut the game off instead. The repetitive dialogue issue has turned me off from a lot of other games like Lethal Enforcers, for example.
The sheriff. You ain't gonna get me, Sheriff. Voodoo, Sheriff. He's lit. Ow! Get back or I'll blow him away. Ow! He's lit.
Even the newer Mario games suffer from this, and it's a part of what prevents me from enjoying those games as much as I'd like to. Some of the main boss lines were overly cheesy at times, but they were at least tolerable. My absolute favorite was how Claw Grip somehow became a pirate between his NES debut and the GBA game's release.
You'll make a tasty treat.
Nothing felt different during the boss fights with the exception of the GBA exclusive Roberto fight. Though it was a creative fight, it felt out of place to me for a few reasons. First of all, nothing you fight in the game is robotic unless you count Autobombs. That might seem like a minor detail, but this game is supposed to be a dream about a world filled with living creatures that have been cursed. A cursed giant egg-throwing robot doesn't really fit in well with the rest of the enemy characters you face off with. The other thing that stood out to me is that none of the other bosses alternate between two different fighting patterns. Roberto rotates between throwing eggs and stomping to stun your character prior to charging at you. The stomping tactic was used a few times in Super Mario Bros. 3 in fights against some of the Koopa Kids or Giant Hammer Brothers in Giant Land, but seeing it here surprised me. I thought the fight was imaginative and a fun challenge, but it felt like it should have been part of a different game. The 4 playable characters also felt very different in the NES version of Super Mario Bros. 2. When you tried platforming with Toad, you could feel his shortcomings in jumping compared to Luigi the Long Jumper, for example. In Super Mario Advance, I feel like they leveled out a lot of the playing field by making all of the characters more similar to one another. Sure, the princess still floats and Luigi still takes enormously high jumps compared to the others, but high jumps in the game were really, really high for all 4 characters. This may have been altered to make the ace coins and floating hearts more accessible for all characters, but I feel like it does dumb down what little strategy was held in character selection in the NES version. It's probably a little bit strange to complain about a game feeling too easy, but there's something to be said about a lost time when games used to challenge you by making you feel like each life was a gift. Beating Super Mario Bros. 2 on NES for the first time without any help felt amazing to me. Free lives were scarce and not guaranteed in the slot machine game. Enemies didn't bloat up to give you more of a landing area for difficult platforming sections, and if you died too many times, you got a real game over. The GBA game takes some of that pressure away by making health and lives very accessible. Health replenishing items are no longer restricted to small hearts that appear after killing many enemies, but can instead be pulled out of the ground in the form of a heart radish or smashed out of giant Shy Guys. These hearts are literally everywhere. You can even find them in boss battles where there's usually a sprout or two to be pulled up. I felt dirty using these instead of staring death in the face like I normally would in the NES game. In Super Mario Advance, potions are also plentiful. Entry into subspace used to be restricted to 1 or 2 potions per level, but I was pulling them out of random vases I kept finding throughout the entire game. I was surprised to find that the health meter in Super Mario Advance was extended from the usual 4-slot health meter to 5 slots, but getting this perk was infrequent for me. I wasn't always sure where to throw these new potions in these new locations, and often came up empty-handed after entering subspace. These vases not only provided potions, but also had other bonus items like POW blocks and turtle shells that could be brought back into the level as usual. For some reason in the Super Mario Advance version, turtle shells now bounce off walls and can hurt you, a lesson that I had to learn the hard way. The occasional vase also contained a free life, or at least a mini-game of sorts. On the topic of extra lives, there are a ridiculous number of them to scoop up in Super Mario Advance compared to the NES version. You get free lives for collecting all 5 ace coins, you get them for killing 9 enemies in a row like other Mario games, you can free them from bubbles in random places in certain levels, and you still even have a chance to win more by playing the slot machine. Having so many of these opportunities to save my skin made me feel like I was a little kid flying through the game using the Game Genie's Infinite Lives code. While these changes made the game easier in principle, there were some other changes made to the game that increased its difficulty for all the wrong reasons. One of my biggest gripes is the way that the screen scrolls in Super Mario Advance. It's very abrupt, and I was constantly feeling like I needed to adjust the camera when there was no camera in the original game. At times, the game looked normal, but other times it felt like I was zoomed in too close. I understand that Super Mario Advance was meant for a smaller screen, but it wasn't until later into the game that I realized that you could move the viewpoint around to see more of the level. This wasn't clear in the manual. The manual says that you can change the camera angle, but it only pans the player's view up or down. There were times when I would die because I couldn't see below or above me because I didn't understand the manual's instructions. I'd jump up into enemies or take leaps of faith only to find that there were platforms below that I could have used for a safe crossing. I would have preferred a smaller overall screen rather than the panning option. There were also some weird programming things that threw me for a loop as well. A change was made to the gameplay in the final face-off with Wart. Usually my tactic is to stand on the furthest platform and pick up veggies when they pop up below me, jump behind Wart, and throw them in his mouth from behind. In the Super Mario Advance version, they totally removed the ability to pick up veggies from on top of that platform, and you also can't attack Wart from behind. I've never been good at avoiding Wart's mouth bubbles, so this fight was much slower for me than usual because of these modifications. A blatant programming problem has to do with the logs coming up over the waterfall. These were extremely unpredictable compared to those in the NES game. I'm used to a log coming up over the top of the water with the next one in line following closely behind, but in the GBA game, the logs took their sweet time to appear if they even bothered to do so, and I plummeted to my doom over and over again as a result. It felt like I was playing Jesus in the Temple from King of Kings on the NES rather than a supposed improved version of Super Mario Bros. 2. I probably burnt through at least 5 lives in this part alone. I also felt like I was playing a weird version of Russian roulette every time I decided to pull stuff up out of the ground. Pulling up the big items was always exciting, but the delay often left me vulnerable to death from oncoming enemies. Because I never knew what I was going to find in there, I didn't take many chances toward the end of the game when my lives started to dwindle. I also don't quite know how to explain it, but everything in Super Mario Advance feels slower than the NES version. Throwing enemies, jumping across platforms, digging up a square of sand, the slot machine, and even the speed of sniff-it bullets all seem to be happening in slow motion. Gone are the days when you could pull up a bomb and throw it in time not to get hurt. I was playing on a CRT, so I know that the delays that I was experiencing weren't coming from the input lag, but I did find myself taking hits and dying a lot more than I usually would. There was one thing that confused me pretty badly. I was fighting in Birdo, and after dying for what felt like the millionth time, I ended up standing on her head. I accidentally pushed the button to pick up an item and consequently ripped her bow off. I don't even know what happened at first, but why can you even do this? What's the purpose? It's not even like the bow can hurt anything when you throw it, or that there's some kind of line that pops up in the game to explain why this is important. And I know that the NES's game manual says that Ostro, Red Birdo, is a boy that thinks that he's a girl, but adding in this bow removal detail was confusing in the midst of battle. One of the most disappointing things in the game for me was something that I kind of expected might happen, but kind of hoped that hadn't changed, and that was the spelling of enemy names. I used to insist to friends that the character that people called Birdo was really Ostro, and this is actually true in both the manual and ending credits of the NES game. I was sad to see that the names were corrected in the Mario Advance game, but I guess it does make sense to update that error. Other spelling issues were corrected as well, like fixing Cloglip, which was supposed to be Clogrip. It was another little bit of charm scrubbed out of one of my favorite games, but again, I feel like it was a fair fix. I'm by no means trying to say that Super Mario Advance was a failure or that I'd never play it again. It definitely has its own charming visuals and unique mechanics to enjoy, and I really adore the replayability factor in this particular version. Despite all of its greatness, though, many of the limitations that I felt playing through it would likely push me toward picking up the NES version for a quick playthrough. I can certainly see myself coming back to Super Mario Advance to finish finding all of the ace coins and try out that curious second quest with Yoshi, but overall, I'd still rank the NES version as the better trip through the world of Subcon. Thank you very much for watching. What do you guys think about these two versions of Super Mario Bros. 2? Does the All-Stars version blow these two out of the water? Let me know what you think. Until next time.